meeting of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board meeting. I hope all of you are well. I appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon. We have a packed agenda, and so I want to begin by reading the ethics statement. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it is the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. I want to take this opportunity also to remind all of you that this session is being recorded, and I want to respectfully ask everyone to mute themselves if they are not speaking. Be forewarned that I'll mute you if you don't mute yourself. Renee, I think that it's now time to call the roll.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Jeff Anstead, William Barber III,
Present.
Veronica Carter.
She will be here shortly. She's in a board meeting, but she said she would be here.
Thank you. Jamie Cole.
Present.
Randy Haven O'Donnell.
Present.
Jim Johnson.
Present.
Marion Johnson Thompson. Carolina Fonseca Jimenez.
Present.
Deepak Kumar.
Present.
Danelle Lobdell.
Present.
Marilyn Marsh Robinson.
Present.
Naima Muhammad.
Present.
Rodney Sadler Jr. Carlos Velasquez.
Present.
Elke Weil.
Present.
Sherry White Williamson.
Jeez, I saw her on.
Sherry, can you hear us?
Present. Having trouble unmuting.
Great. All right. I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much. Again, thanks all of you for being here today. You have received today's agenda via email. I hope you've had the opportunity to review it. If there are no amendments to the agenda, I will entertain a motion to accept it as printed. Do I have a motion to accept the agenda?
Motion to accept.
Accepted. A motion to accept. Do I have a second?
I second.
It's been moved and properly seconded that we accept today's agenda as printed. Thank you very much. At the same time, you also received the minutes from the May 24th meeting. I hope you've had an opportunity to review those minutes as well. If there are no amendments or adjustments to those meeting minutes, I will entertain a motion to accept the meeting minutes as printed. Do I have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I move the motions be accepted.
It has been moved. Do I have a second?
A second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Could both of you please identify yourself for the record? Who introduced the motion? I can't see everyone.
Williamson.
Thank you, Ms. White Williamson, and then Ms. Haven O'Donnell was the second. Thank you so much. We will move right along to new business, and it's incredibly exciting and my opportunity now to introduce DEQ's current secretary, Ms. Elizabeth Beiser. Governor Cooper's appointed secretary Beiser in July to lead the department, a department that she knows well. She previously served as Director of Legislative and Governmental Affairs when the agency was known as the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Since then, she has worked in the private sector, including senior policy roles at the Recycling Partnership, a national nonprofit organization. Secretary Advisor, we are extremely excited and delighted to have you here today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. The floor belongs to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay before I keep going?
We're good.
Great. So first of all, I wanted just to take the time to thank each and every one of you for the time and energy that you give to this advisory board. You know, I appreciate your continued service to the state. As you know, this board plays a critical role and brings necessary perspective to the work of the department. I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you as we work together. I had the pleasure of meeting with the chairs and vice chair last week. And I'm just want to let you know I'm committed to working with you to build on the work that you've done over the past 3 years. Thought I'd take a moment today just to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in the eastern part of the state in Columbus County and Johnson County. I'm a double Tar Heel. I did my undergrad and MPA at Carolina. And as Dr. Johnson mentioned, I served as the Director of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs, Director at when it was Diener a decade ago. And so I couldn't be happier about coming back to the department. I'll let you know I'm almost through the confirmation process. I was hoping maybe I'd be all the way through at this point, but we're almost there. I'm anticipating a final vote tomorrow. And, you know, so as I'm getting ready to get the official word that I am here for good, I wanted to, I've been reflecting on the work of this advisory board. And I really think back to a quote that I heard back in grad school, talking about how government has worked much more effectively and efficiently for some residents more than others. And as I, you know, start this work here with the department, my goal as secretary is to make sure that our department is working for all residents, regardless of who you are, where you live, what your income is, or any other factors that happen to be present. As you know, we're charged with following the science and following the law, and everything we do should be accessible and transparent to everyone. You know, honesty, integrity, and openness are really key factors that informed my approach to this role as secretary. I believe strongly in building consensus and fostering productive dialogue. A lot can get done when we get around the table together and work through tough issues. And so, you know, as I'm arriving back at the department, I'm trying to bring fresh eyes and fresh perspective. And I want your help to see where our processes are working well, where they need some work. Is a natural point for us to take a step back and assess our strengths and where the opportunities are. You know, see where they need some work. And so I'm going to be sending you all a survey here soon this week to get your perspective on the work of the board to date, you know, where things are working well, where things may need adjusting, and what you hope to achieve as a part of this board. So I appreciate you taking the time in advance to share your thoughts with me. So overall, Dr. Johnson, thanks for the time today. I'm looking forward to the meeting, looking forward to working with all of you, and couldn't be happier to be here.
Thank you so very much, Secretary Advisor. We hope things go well tomorrow, and we look forward to working with you. And I'm going to ask everyone on the advisory board to respond to your survey right away, so we can get about the business that we think is important to address equity issues in the state of North Carolina. So again, thank you for your time today. Okay, moving along to agenda item number 2, on the American Recovery Plan and funding for state broadband initiatives. I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Nathaniel Denney, the Deputy Secretary for Broadband and Digital Equity with the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. Previously, Mr. Denney was Chief of Staff and Legislative Liaison in the Department of Information Technology, beginning back in 2017. Mr. Denney, thanks so much for being with us today. The floor belongs to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also to Secretary Beiser and to members of the board for giving us an opportunity to talk about the governor's plan for broadband. It's a critical need for the state. The COVID pandemic has really made obvious the urgency of the problem of lacking connections, lacking subscriptions to high-speed internet across the state. We know in DIT that about 1.1 million households don't have access to high-speed internet in their homes, and many do have access. They've got a line running by their house, but can't afford to subscribe. Many additional residents don't have the training or skills necessary to fully participate in the digital economy on a day-by-day basis, or even relate necessarily to how the high-speed internet could relate to their lives, right? So we've got a tremendous problem across the state that has only become more urgent. You know, with during the pandemic, everyone has struggled to figure out how to work from home, how in many cases to learn from home, how to access telemedicine services on your home internet connection. These are all issues that many of us recognized as urgent before, but everyone has really come to see the pressing need here. Fortunately, along with this kind of once-in-a-lifetime challenge that we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address this need. And Governor Cooper has proposed to use American Rescue Plan dollars to permanently close the digital divide in North Carolina once and for all. The plan is built across several pillars, and altogether, the governor's vision is one of achieving full digital equity in North Carolina. Digital equity is a term that comes with its own definition, and it means that the need to make sure that every individual and every community has the access, the affordability, and the skills to access that high-speed internet and to fully participate in today's economy. So the way we can achieve digital equity is by working across several key pillars. One is infrastructure deployment, making sure that everyone has fiber or other high-speed internet connection available at their home. The second, as I mentioned before, is affordability. Too many North Carolinians have to pay more than 2% of their annual income just to afford an internet subscription. And then third is digital literacy. More than 400,000 households don't have a laptop or a desktop computer at home. Many don't have a smartphone, and over 1 million lack that digital literacy skill that's necessary to take advantage of what the internet has to offer in today's economy. India, I believe you are controlling the slides. Would you mind jumping to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So Governor Cooper's plan, again, is to use ARP money, American Rescue Plan money, to become a top 5 state for high-speed internet adoption. And so that means not just that access piece, but the subscription piece. We want to eliminate the digital divide by making sure that a subscription to the high-speed internet is affordable for all households, especially those with children, so that no one suffers from the homework gap, right? As we shift away from print resources in classrooms and rely more and more on internet assignments, the lack of a connection or device at home is all the more damaging to children who can't access those assignments. We want to make sure that any investments to close gaps in subscription rates across the state don't just lift up an average rate of connectivity or subscription, but specifically target demographic groups that traditionally have even less access to the internet. And we want to make sure that devices, training, and other tools are available so that, again, everyone can participate in that digital economy. We do all this by setting some very specific targets for in the governor's plan. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So how we define success in the governor's plan will be first and foremost making sure that 98% of households in North Carolina have access to a high-speed internet connection. Right now, if you look at the FCC's data, we're at about 95%. The problem, though, is that the FCC's data inflates the rate of access across the state and, in fact, the country. The FCC gets data from internet providers about where they offer subscriptions, and they look at locations by census block. So if a single household in a given census block has high-speed internet, then the FCC declares that entire census block served. The result, of course, is that the rate of households that lack either access or subscriptions is much higher than the current best available data. That has to figure into our plan. We have to go from a fake 95% to a real 98%, which means getting detailed mapping and data at a location level, at a household level across the state, which is addressed in the governor's plan. We want to move from 73% of North Carolina households with a home internet, a high-speed internet subscription to 80%. And as I mentioned with the last slide, we want to make sure that's not just an 80% average, but we want to get all racial groups up to that 80% threshold. Right now, white households in North Carolina subscribe to the internet, high-speed internet at about 76%, while Black, Native American, and Latino households all lag substantially behind. So we want to get everybody up to 80%. And then again, as I mentioned, we want to close the homework gap once and for all by hitting a 100% subscription rate for children, for households with children in them. Can you move to the next slide, please? The plan to hit these numbers comes with a substantial investment using American Rescue Plan dollars, $1.2 billion across those key pillars that I mentioned before: infrastructure, affordability, and digital literacy. The governor's plan to achieve digital equity calls for $600 million investment in infrastructure deployment. That's over 3 primary programs. One is a variation of the state's current last mile infrastructure grant process, which we refer to as the GREAT program, thanks to a nifty legislative acronym. That process right now is extremely prescriptive, and we can only fund grants for providers that come to us suggesting projects. So the internet providers apply to the Department of Information Technology and say, we'll cover 1,000 households with internet at this speed, and we'll address this number of businesses and community anchors. And then we score it. The providers get to protest competing applications, and it's a very, as I said, prescriptive and arduous process. We want to open that process up so that it's streamlined, that we can make this investment efficiently. Because we know that neighboring states also intend to use ARPA funds to address the digital divide. And we want to make sure that it's open to all counties in the state, because that process has been tied to certain tier economically distressed counties previously. We also want a more flexible approach that would allow us to go directly to the market in a competition in partnership with a county government that has also received ARPA funds to basically say, look, we know that, for example, MCNC has existing fiber infrastructure in this county. We know that these internet providers serve parts of the county, and yet we still have, say, 2,500 homes that don't have access to high-speed internet. And we want an agile tool that will allow us to go directly to the market to solicit coverage. And then we need an even more flexible tool that can address needs that aren't long-term significant fiber installation projects, because we know those take considerable time. They often, depending on the geography, are hard to navigate if it's Rocky Mountain terrain, for example. So we need a more flexible approach that works for small scale fixed wireless projects or satellite projects or telephone pole replacements that can host high-speed internet equipment. And so the governor's proposed $100 million for that approach too, for that most flexible grant program that will be open to nonprofits and local governments to complete projects at a local level. I should note that the $600 million investment comes with $900 million of private sector or federal commitments through the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunities Fund or grant matching programs. So we would be looking at a total $1.5 billion investment in infrastructure across the state. The governor also proposes more than $400 million to address the affordability crisis in the state. The FCC has created a program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit that through the CARES Act that basically allows for a $50 a month subsidy for a low-income household anywhere in the country, $75 a month subsidy for tribal households. That program started out with an initial $3.2 billion investment, and we know that that subsidy program will run out of funds quickly. Our hope is that Congress and the federal government will extend the life of that program, but the governor proposes to offer a $50 a month subsidy for low-income households in the state for 380,000, low-income households across the state after that FCC program runs out. To hit the subscription rate numbers, the targets that we've established, especially for households with school children, we know that we're going to have to address the affordability approach. We know that we can get more affordable internet options if there's more competition, if there are more internet providers in a given market, but still there will be all too many North Carolinians who can't afford that monthly service. And so this proposal is really critical to hitting the subscription rates that we need and to closing that digital divide and approaching a state of full digital equity. And then last but certainly not least, the governor proposes $165 million for digital literacy tools. This means device support for low-income households. We have a number of nonprofits in the state that refurbish used computers, teach critical digital skills to students who are recrafting those devices, and then make those devices available back to low-income households across the state. And we'd like to scale those programs up to benefit more North Carolinians. We would also like to fund a range of digital literacy grant programs and partnerships designed to offer upskilling and training and other support at a local level across the state. Everything from a small grant like the state's and the Institute for Emerging Issues current Band in C grant program that can be as small as $5,000 and help a county plan to achieve digital literacy across the community, up to building full-scale innovative connectivity hubs that can be a site for the kinds of training we're talking about, a place where you can go get your device fixed, where you can go do your homework or take a private, secure telemedicine appointment in your community. So that's the overall outline of the governor's proposal. You know, let me say just a couple of quick things about it. One, to do that, the department needs to scale up its capacity pretty dramatically. We've got 10 people in our broadband infrastructure office now that have really made miracles happen to get about $15 million a year out the door for grant programs. So if we're going to be good stewards of these resources and maximize our effects across the state, our impacts across the state, then we need to be able to effectively and efficiently move that money more quickly. And so we need additional data, analytics and mapping support, grant management support, integrity and audit support, and so on and so forth to execute this plan. And we've gotten good feedback from the General Assembly on that approach. The other thing that I would say about this plan is we talked a lot about, or I talked a lot about digital equity and how it's not just a broadband problem. It's really not enough to lay a line of fiber past your house if you can't afford it or you don't have a computer. To highlight that mission, we have now created a new office in the Department of Information Technology, the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. It's the first of its kind in the country, elevating that equity mission parallel to the infrastructure mission to make sure that we're keeping that in mind wherever we're doing an internet infrastructure project. And so that's a significant development for the department and a reflection of the governor's commitment to full digital equity and addressing this problem in a way that benefits all individuals and communities across the state. And then lastly, I'll say in North Carolina, as I'm sure you all know, the state's fiscal relief funds that came from the American Rescue Plan have to be appropriated. So we've been working with the General Assembly to try and get the governor's plan appropriated. If you look at the House budget that came out a couple of weeks ago, they proposed to invest in over $1 billion of this plan. So we're very excited about a shared bipartisan commitment to making this work. The General Assembly to this point has not expressed a lot of interest in funding a subsidy program and addressing the affordability piece here. They have in the House budget suggested $60 million for digital literacy, but they are primarily proposing to fund the infrastructure piece here. Fortunately, it looks like the federal government's infrastructure plan that has passed the Senate and is sitting with the House now would extend that federal FCC broadband benefit. So I think we can work to raise awareness of that program here across the state. I'll follow up with this group if it's okay with Secretary Visor and Chair Johnson to try and get more information about that benefit program to all of you and ask your help to spread the word so that more North Carolinians can access that benefit. So I think that's pretty much it. I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks again for having me today.
Mr. Denney, thanks so much. We have time for a couple of questions if there are questions from the advisory board. Anyone? Mr. Denney, I have a question. This is a big initiative. To what extent has the department thought about making sure that people from EJ communities benefit both in terms of business opportunities and job creation in dealing with the digital divide? Is there any conscious effort to be more inclusive in the supply chain to get the work done?
Mr. Chair, that's an excellent question, and that question gets at one of the reasons we've created an Office of Digital Equity and Literacy to make sure we're thinking through those questions, not just after we're making an award or after we're investing in a community, but throughout our process. I would say right now that the current nature, and forgive me for the phone going off in the background here, but the current statutory restrictions on the state's broadband program, the GREAT grants that I referenced on this slide here as part of the infrastructure package, restrict participation to existing internet providers that are private sector or rural co-ops. We would propose to expand that program so that potentially publicly owned entities could also participate, so that nonprofits could participate in that program as well. But again, that statute is very prescriptive as it's written today, and our hands would be relatively limited. I think where we have an opportunity there is on the digital literacy piece, and where we're building community partnerships at a local level with local education groups, local nonprofits, folks who are already thinking through equity challenges locally. And you know, right now that program as proposed is very broad and gives us a lot of flexibility to build good partnerships locally. But as we move forward, I would say we'll be looking at stakeholders across the environmental justice community and equity groups to help give us feedback, help point us in the right direction, and make those kinds of investments. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, within the private sector players in the market, does the state have any leeway to look at their supply chains and their tier 2 spending to make sure that there's more equity in the distribution of these dollars to benefit communities?
Not currently. We do not have the ability to build that into our grant requirements currently. I think where we have an opportunity is by working on getting better and more localized data and mapping of the issue, so that, and this is again where our current opportunity is, so that we can make sure that any grant proposal, any proposed use of funds is targeting the right communities and making sure that everyone gets access to that benefit.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Denney?
So Mr. Denney, thank you so much. I do want to applaud the effort on creating the Office of Digital Literacy, Digital Equity. The question is that these 4 elements that you described about infrastructure, affordability, digital literacy and enablement, and administrative piece, how much involvement EJ communities will have in structuring while you're going to preparing this, grant program and stuff? Oftentimes what happens is when you prepare these grant programs, certain organizations are not even able to apply for this because it's always after the fact that, yes, you can also apply. So that structural piece, or if I may, structural discrimination that happens to certain communities, how do you account for that? Is there an effort to structure that office in a way that there is proper engagement of the EJ communities while you are structuring these efforts?
Again, great question. I appreciate that. And I think that is an area where we will need ongoing feedback and dialogue to make sure that what we build, and again, we're working for broad, flexible authority to build these local partnerships in conjunction with the local groups that are working on these issues. Now, it's worth pointing out that our digital equity focus has not had a built-in touch point with environmental justice as a standalone concept, is that right? So that is an area where I think we will need to improve, and where I think we will need to work closely with this board and other stakeholders to make sure we're building it right and making sure that our process is equitable, that we're not just saying we want to deliver an equitable product.
Thank you so much, Mr. Denney, for your time and presentation. We're grateful to you.
So this is Naima. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I just wanted to add to the comments, that when we talk about investments and initiatives and bringing everybody into the fold, the thing that we've always found that that's what gets said, but in the process and at the end result, our communities are always left out one way or another. And if you don't prepare up front to make sure that there's particular attention paid to these communities and that everything is done to bring people up to par, then that we get left out of the mix, either through the literacy or the implementation or whatever. But it happens. And the example I will give you is when the flooding took place. I remember in 1999 when Hurricane Floyd hit eastern North Carolina and the recovery process was set up. And what we found as we worked with citizens in eastern North Carolina where the flood actually took place, the paperwork was so intense that the very people that was the most impacted could not maneuver through that paperwork, and many of them did not get the help they needed to this day because of that. So we are not intentional up front about making sure that everything we do is inclusive of the EJ communities. We will be left out.
Mr. Chair, I have one last question, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Denney, we appreciate that you have this great plan, but will there be any plans to subsidize low-income households who may not be able to afford routers or other equipment to assure that they have internet in their home?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. And let me quickly acknowledge the prior question too. I very much appreciate that point. I'd like to propose that we have a follow-up conversation with as many members of the board as would find it useful with our director of that Office of Digital Equity and Literacy to talk about how we're building that and how we can make sure that we're not excluding anybody on the front end. So I very much appreciate that last comment. Returning to the subsidy piece, so I think there are two main angles there on how we can help low-income households. One, as I mentioned, the governor proposed $420 million for an actual direct $50 a month subsidy of internet service for low-income households. We have not had any luck with the General Assembly on that point yet, but what we have got working for our advantage is the federal infrastructure bill, which appears, at least what's passed the Senate so far, extends that emergency broadband benefit at the federal level, actually gets rid of the word emergency, so it makes sure makes clear that it's not just a COVID thing, but it's addressing an ongoing challenge, and makes sure that that program will be available for the foreseeable future. Where we will focus our efforts if we're not able to get an appropriation to address affordability needs from the General Assembly will be on driving awareness of that process and making sure that everyone knows it's available to them. Governor Cooper sent a letter to all the internet providers in the state because providers have to sign up, right? The actual internet providers from whom we subscribe have to agree to participate in the program before it's available to any of their customers. And the governor reached out to each of them, encouraging them to sign up. Many of the state's providers did, nearly all, in fact, did sign up. And where we're focused right now is on that raising awareness with customers and pushing the providers to do the same. Right now, North Carolina, last numbers I saw was 8th in the country in terms of state signups for the emergency broadband benefit. Right now, we're lagging behind Pennsylvania, and we have to change that. So again, where I can use and where the department and Governor Cooper can use your help is by helping to raise awareness of that program. I'll send some additional information to all of you, and urge you to please distribute it across your networks. But you mentioned the modems specifically, and so I want to come back to the device support and break fix services element of the digital literacy plan. Our goal here, and again, we requested $165 million. The House version of the budget includes $60 million for digital literacy support. If that becomes law and we have access to that $60 million appropriation, then one of the three major priorities for that use of funds will be finding partners that can help us get devices to low-income households across North Carolina that don't have them. So that means laptops, desktop computers, hotspots if necessary, although those are temporary solutions, and we want to try to find more permanent solutions, but also break fix services so that we can help North Carolinians who have old or broken devices get what they need to connect. So that device piece, having the right equipment, is a really critical point here, and that is very much a priority no matter what level of funding we see from the General Assembly.
Thank you.
Again, Mr. Denney, thank you. As an advisory board, I want to encourage us to think seriously about re-engaging Mr. Denney and the people at DIT. This is a very, very important issue, and I think Ms. Muhammad is right that we want to make sure that there is equitable access, not only to just broadband, but my view is we need equitable access to the jobs and the businesses that go along with this initiative. We don't want to keep people poor and need a subsidy. If we can create an opportunity for them to grow and thrive and be able to take control of their own destiny, I think that that's ultimately what we want to do. And it sounds like we have an opportunity to share our views with Mr. Denney and his fellow colleagues in DIT. So let's put that in the parking lot up front on the first parking space and see can we have a follow-up conversation, if that's okay with everybody.
Thank you so much.
Again, Mr. Denney, thank you. Let's we're already behind, so let's move right along to our next agenda item, which is an update on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative petition to EMC and DEQ actions. If you recall, at our last board meeting, we heard from the neighboring state of Virginia, as well as the Southern Environmental Law Center and the National Resource Defense Council regarding the petition before the North Carolina Environment Management Commission. Here with us today again is Director Zaniskas to provide us with an update. Sir, thank you so much for being with us again. We appreciate you taking the time to share with us this update.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Mike Brzezinskis. I'm the Director of the Division of Air Quality, and really appreciate the invite to be with you today. The presentation I'm going to give is part update and part educational on a complex matter that we're working on, and that's the petition for rulemaking and the rulemaking process to become a participating state in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. Next slide, please. So as you know, the Division of Air Quality and the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission, or EMC, received a petition for rulemaking at the beginning of the year related to North Carolina becoming a participant in this RGGI program. Understand that y'all heard generally about that at your last meeting. So today I'm going to share some of the things that have happened since your May meeting. And I'll share with you some of the details of what's a complex regulatory program, some of the foundational elements, how it works, and how the petition rules differ from other participating RGGI states in the program. And importantly, I'm also going to conclude by sharing with you some of the next steps in the process. So next slide, please. Quick outline of what's happened thus far. The petition was received again in January. It was taken up by the Air Quality Committee, or AQC, of the EMC at a special meeting in mid-June, where they recommended that the EMC grant the petition. And at a subsequent meeting of the EMC, they did, in fact, grant that petition on July 13th. That granting of the petition really just commences the rulemaking process. And so now the text of the rules that are included in the petition are with DEQ and DAQ to start analyzing and take through the rulemaking process. Next slide, please. Really quickly, just an overview, and you may have heard about this at your last meeting of what RGGI really is, but it's a cooperative market-based effort amongst 11 states where a cap is put in place to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector. And it represents the first cap and invest regional initiative implemented in the US. Next slide, please. The program started back in 2009 with 10 participating states, contracted for a few years when New Jersey withdrew and then resumed participation. Virginia joined the program earlier this year after a multi-year process, and then Pennsylvania is in the process of joining RGGI as well. Next slide, please. All right, so some of the core program elements of the RGGI program, it's really centered on a cap and trade system where each participating state develops laws or rules that establish a declining annual carbon dioxide emissions budget. Ultimately, this comes in the form of allowances as well, and states allocate those allowances to one combined regional market for auction in all the other participating states. Those electric generating units, or EGUs, or we can think of them as affected facilities, bid on those allowances in the regional market. And this applies to these fossil fueled affected facilities that are greater than a certain size, greater than 25 megawatts in size. And overall, the program element and model program element is to reduce those CO2 emission budgets per year by 3%. So they stair-step down over time out to 2030. Currently, those budgets regionally are constant after the year 2030. However, it's our understanding that RGGI and the participating states are conducting a program review where they may consider additional reductions and additional cap beyond 2030. Next slide is related to compliance. And so it's very simple. An allowance, as we're talking about this program, must be held by an affected facility for every short ton of carbon dioxide emitted. Those allowances can be banked for future use, and the allowances can also be purchased and sold on the secondary market. And there's another program element related to revenue and investments. And so in all of the other states, minus a small administrative fee, auction revenues are returned to the states for their allocation of allowances, and that is often defined by state law or rule. Each RGGI state uses those revenues a little differently, and mainly investing in energy efficiency or direct bill assistance to customers in their states or other environmental programs. And I'll cover this a little bit in greater detail later, but as set forth in the petition rule here in North Carolina, the program deviates from this format on these points. Next slide, please. So just a quick illustration about how this program works in all of these other states, where allowances, and in the term allowances for each of the participating states, go to a regional and where affected facilities must purchase the requisite amount of allowances. That money comes back through RGGI Inc. and is redistributed as revenue back to those participating states. And again, those states' laws and rules define what happens with those revenues, usually reinvestment in things that result in additional carbon dioxide emissions, either energy efficiency or direct bill assistance to those electric customers. So the North Carolina petition, on the next slide, please. The North Carolina petition deviates from the existing RGGI format in a couple of different ways. There's some expanded applicability we'll talk a little bit more about in a slide or two. There's this consignment auction approach, which I'll define further. It treats all emissions equally, both fossil fuel and biomass. Some other states have provisions where biomass is considered carbon neutral and not treated equally with fossil fuel emissions. And there's a steeper decline in the CO2 budget in the North Carolina petition rule, about 4.7% per year, in order to meet Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80 goal of a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions from the electric generating sector by 2030. relative to 2005 levels. With regard to that last bullet on the slide there, if we can return to that, thank you, India. You know, the question is, will this program meet the 70% goal in reality? And so we have some preliminary analysis of this policy option that shows that after consideration of electricity that will need to be imported from out of state to meet energy demands in our state, the actual CO2 reductions will be somewhere on the order of 61% below the 2005 baseline levels. So this is something we'll be analyzing further throughout this rulemaking process. The next slide simply illustrates kind of what that base budget would look like at a beginning year after becoming a participating state, and then what it looks like out in 2030 and thereafter. So you see significant stair-stepping down of the allowable allowances in this system. All right, next slide, please. Another difference in the petition rule set is the applicability to biomass and biofuels. So that those facilities would be included in the North Carolina RGGI rule. Also included are industrial units, which are included regardless of their grid connectivity. And then I mentioned earlier that biomass emissions are not considered carbon neutral in this particular set of rules submitted by the petitioner. Now, in the petition, it listed, there were a couple lists of affected facilities. And so over the next 3 slides, I'm going to share with you those lists, but we've done a little review of those lists, and we've put an asterisk by certain facilities that will actually be exempted from the rule as they do not meet the definitions of an affected facility in the actual rule text of the petition. So the next slide gives you the first set of affected facilities. And essentially this would be all the Duke Energy facilities in North Carolina, with the exception of one with the asterisk there, again, that doesn't serve a generator greater than 25 megawatts. All of these facilities are under the purview of the State Utilities Commission. On the next slide, you get a sense of some of the other affected facilities that are also power producers that are not under the purview of the State Utilities Commission. And again, there's one facility with an asterisk here that would be exempted. And then on the next slide shows some other affected facilities that are industrial facilities. And so there are 3 facilities we've identified here that would be exempted, given that they don't serve a generator greater than 25 megawatts. So you get a sense on the last 2 slides, there are a number of facilities that are not covered or under the purview of the State Utilities Commission, while that first list, which would Duke facilities, are covered by the State Utilities Commission. All right, next slide. All right, so I mentioned a consignment auction approach. You might be wondering, what's that mean? So instead of allocating the statewide carbon dioxide budget to a regional market directly, like what is done in all of the other participating states, North Carolina's budget will be allocated to the affected facilities as conditional carbon dioxide allowances. And those conditional allowances cannot be used directly for compliance. They have to be consigned or sold to the market first. So once a conditional allowance passes through that market, it's no longer conditional and it can be used for compliance. Next slide, please. At the same time, the affected facilities must still purchase and hold the requisite amount of allowances for compliance purposes, either through the same market that they just sold their conditional allowances at, or a secondary market. The auction revenues are then returned to the affected facilities that consign allowances to the auction rather than the state. And so North Carolina would be the first RGGI state to implement this type of approach. And so the next slide illustrates that. So it's kind of taking the earlier slide in the schematic and inserting the North Carolina process into it. And so again, under this consignment approach, the state receives no direct revenues. The auction proceeds, if there are proceeds, instead flow back to the affected facilities. And this is, again, a little bit of a unique component to the petition rules here in North Carolina. Now, in concept, the entity that regulates the electric utility rates in North Carolina, that's the State Utilities Commission, may consider any proceeds that go back to those facilities in a way that it disallows it to be profit to the utilities, but rather should be applied to programs that assist ratepayers or energy efficiency programs that would further reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And there's language in the proposed rule text that attempts to achieve that outcome through the requirement that each electric public utility file a plan with the Utilities Commission on how they'll spend any auction revenues for the public's benefit or strategic energy or other purposes approved by the Utilities Commission. I'll note that there does not appear to be a similar mechanism for consideration of the proceeds for the other utilities or the other industrial sources that are included in the petition rules. And that certainly makes this fiscal analysis a complex one, but we're working on it. So the next slide gives you those next steps. So with the granting of the petition, the rulemaking process has commenced, and that means our staff are now working on the fiscal note and analysis that is necessary for a complex rulemaking like this. There are elements to that analysis where we will need the help of the public staff of the Utilities Commission, especially when it comes to impacts to electricity rates. We will also be working on an environmental justice report in coordination with our DEQ environmental justice team. I'd say on both of these important next steps, fiscal analysis and the environmental justice analysis, I will admit that we don't have all of the answers yet. There are a range of outcomes that must be explored with regard to benefits and co-benefits, costs, savings to both citizens and affected facilities. And so those are critical pieces to fully understanding any economic or energy or environmental impacts on vulnerable, environmental justice, and underserved communities in North Carolina. Once we've fleshed out all of those details, all of that information will go back to the Environmental Management Commission with a request to proceed to public hearing. And if granted, the public process would then commence, including a public hearing on all of this material. After consideration of comments received in that public process, the final rule package and fiscal note would go back to see the final action. And certainly, if you have particular thoughts about any of this work, and this is kind of the bottom line here today, and what's generally been mostly an educational set of slides, if you have any thoughts on elements of this important work, we welcome that input in any part of this process and welcome you reaching out to myself or some others on our team if you have any questions. With the final slide, next slide, please. There's just some reference material if you're further interested in some of the petition text and some of the summary of the air quality and EMC. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield and open it up for questions if there's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Do we have questions from the board?
Naima, can you go back to the slide before this one? Okay, so my question is, when you mentioned the environmental justice report, what kind of things that you all have in mind with that? What does that entail?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Naima. Yes, I think those are things we are still working through. It's very early in that process, and I noted that we didn't quite have all the answers yet. So if there are particular aspects or thoughts that you all have, we would certainly like to hear them. We are currently reviewing how EPA may have looked at environmental justice in other rulemakings, in the federal rulemakings in the past as a potential blueprint, but we're certainly not wed and haven't made any final decisions on what the approach shall look like. So this is a good time. The timing's good for this presentation today to, again, ask for that feedback on that and all aspects of this process.
Okay, so then my next response to that is, as I was listening to you, I'm thinking the same things we just said to the last presenter should apply here as well, in terms of making sure that the EJ communities are included, not left out, not an afterthought, and not something scrounging to put together at the last minute.
Understood, and great comment. Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, we welcome comments from the board. Please reach out to Renee Kramer. She's part of our team, of course, that's starting to explore how to best go about doing that analysis. So we definitely encourage any thoughts that can help us along the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Mike,
you.
I had a question.
We really quickly, because we're running behind. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
and I can always take an answer offline through email,
Great.
but I just wanted Mike to kind of clarify the, about the State Utilities Commission can ensure proceeds are not revenue to the utility. Is that going to be a matter of fact, or is that something that has to be put into a process that needs to be approved?
Yes, that is an excellent question for which there's not a short or clear answer at this point in time. I think in concept, the Utilities Commission has the ability to consider proceeds in a way that disallows it to be a profit to the utilities. And so how and they use that authority is something that I cannot speak to directly, but certainly we are in discussions with the Utilities Commission on different aspects of the fiscal analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. We appreciate your time and the feedback you gave us and the education process on this initiative.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is Mr. Brian Phillips, who is the supervisor of the Mobile Compliance Branch with the Division of Air Quality. He will be presenting on the Volkswagen settlement phase 2 funding opportunity. We've heard about this before. This is an update. So thank you very much, Mr. Phillips, for being with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Phillips, the Mobile Source Compliance Branch Supervisor, and I'm going to give you a quick update on Volkswagen settlement. I'll start with a little quick overview of what VW did, what we funded in phase 1, and what our plans are for phase 2. So Volkswagen installed and manufactured vehicles with defeat devices on their light-duty diesel vehicles. Approximately 580,000 of these vehicles were affected nationally. 18,000 of those vehicles were registered in the state of North Carolina. Next slide. So North Carolina is ranked 9th out of all the states in the country. If you take California out, we're top 8 in the country with $92 million received from the settlement of the Volkswagen consent decree. Next slide, please. So cars and trucks are the leading cause of pollution in North Carolina, and this settlement funds allow us to replace large heavy-duty trucks and also install light-duty vehicle charging infrastructure for light-duty vehicles. Next slide, please. So what type of vehicles are we talking about? These are representations of vehicles we funded or equipment we funded in phase 1. You'll see school buses, transit buses, shuttle buses, DC fast, and level 2 charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. We also have class 4 through 8 trucks. That includes refuse trucks, box trucks, and larger construction equipment, dump trucks, etc. Next slide, please. So in phase 1, we completed our phase 1 process. We have all our contracts in place. We have funded a total of $24.6 million in projects, 172 vehicles, 27 DC fast charging sites, and 78 level 2 charging sites across the state. And you see from the pie chart, 47% of those vehicles are school buses. 23% were transit buses. The last 16% is on-road vehicles. We committed to spend the full 15% allowed by the Volkswagen consent decree on ZEV charging infrastructure. And you see here we spent 14%. The reason we spent less than 15%, we did have several big projects that fell out after we awarded those projects, and those funds will be applied to our phase 2 process. Next slide, please. So we do have several success stories on the website. I encourage you all to go look at them. Most of our DC fast charging infrastructure. We do have a couple of large trucks that are toward completion. We don't have the full report on the website yet, but they'll be coming very soon. Next slide, please. So for phase two, originally we planned to have 3 phases of funding for VW. We decided to combine phases 2 and 3 into one final phase. There'll be a total of $67.6 million. We have 2 large programs that will spend that money. We're committed to spend the full 15% allowed on ZEV infrastructure for our DC FAST program and our level 2 program to fund public access, workplace, multi-unit dwellings, and state government charging infrastructure. Our diesel bus and vehicle program, we will have our school bus program, which has the largest portion of funding of $27 million. We'll spend 20% of our funds, which is $13.5 million, on transit bus replacements. And our remaining $13 million would be toward our clean heavy-duty electric vehicle replacement program. We are putting a priority on electric replacements on phase 2. We will, however, continue to fund all fuel types if we receive application form and they score high enough to be funded. Next slide, please. So this is the county classifications from the North Carolina Rural Center. We use this as part of our process to determine our spending percentages based on where the vehicles were registered in the states. And by that, we committed to spend at least 68% of our funds in urban and suburban counties and 32% of our funds in rural counties. And in phase 2, we actually phase 1, we actually did a little bit better than that. We actually spent about 42% of our funds in rural counties, which amounts to about $11 million. Next slide, please. So our historically under-resourced county outreach program. This is something that's new for us. We're excited about it. Our team is currently in development of the program outreach materials. And basically this program, we hope to help counties that don't have staff that normally do contracts and grants to identify vehicles that are eligible for funding on the VW program, and also our Diesel Emission Reduction Act program, DERA, which is funded through EPA. And how did we determine these counties for this program? The historically under-resourced counties were those identified as economically distressed with the highest percentages of underserved populations. And those underserved populations are those that meet certain criteria for race and poverty criteria, determined by our environmental justice team. And using that criteria, a county's economic distress is defined and ranked by the NC Department of Commerce, commonly referred to as a county tier. Next slide, please. So we combined those 2 data sets and we came with 31 counties in our draft mitigation plan. We do have new data from our environmental justice team, so the counties may change a little bit in our final plan. And those counties were all counties that had an underserved population of greater than 15%. And then we also removed any tier 2 or tier 3 counties from the list. So those were the next and least distressed counties. Next slide, please. So this is a representation of our draft counties that we have in our mitigation plan for this program. If a county is not in this program, it does not mean we won't do outreach for them. If any county asks for our help, we would give them assistance in determining vehicles that are eligible for funding in our VW Phase 2 program. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that shows the NOx emissions for the 31 counties that we have in our draft mitigation plan under this program. You see there are some higher emissions in some of these counties in this program. Next slide. And this is also the PM 2.5 emissions for these same counties in this program. These are only the mobile NOx emissions, the mobile source emissions for these counties. Next slide, please. So where are we? Like I said, we're currently developing our outreach materials. We do have our phase 1 to phase 2 mitigation plan is out for comments. It'll be out until September 7th. So if you have comments, we do encourage you to submit comments so we can actually address those comments and plan for phase 2. If you have knowing counties that are interested in assistance from us, let us know. We are looking for contacts. We are trying to go through contacts right now to identify who to contact to do outreach initially for this program to see how much interest we have to go out and do this outreach. If you know any fleet managers that may have vehicles that need replacements, let us know. And again, you can submit comments on the phase 2 plan currently right now. Next slide, please. So our next steps, our plan comment period does end on September 7th. We'll draft the final plan, submit to the trustee in the fall. Our team is also working on our request for proposals for phase 2. And again, if you have any comments on scoring criteria, anything like that, that you would like us to consider for phase 2, I encourage you to reach out to us and let us know. We plan to do our evaluation of applications received in the winter, spring of 2021, 2022, and have our phase 2 awards in the spring of 2022. Next slide, please. If you're not currently on our email list and would like to join our email list, you can send the word subscribe to this email address below, DEQ NC VW grants. It's an underscore between NC and VW grants at ncdnr.gov. And you'll receive updates on our RFPs and everything. These are our general contacts. Here's my contact, our public information officer, our outreach person. Next slide, please. And these are our individual program contacts. Our school bus program, Sheila Blanchard, our transit bus program, Melanie Henderson, our clean heavy duty diesel program, Jill Vitus, who's also our DERA program manager. Our DC Fast program is Dave Willis, and our level 2 program is Stephen Rice. Next slide, please. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. If you have any additional questions, you can send me an email. I know we're a little bit short on time today, so I'll definitely respond to any emails or comments you receive. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips, thank you so much for an informative presentation. Fellow board members, Mr. Phillips gave us an action plan, and I would encourage us all to take the initiative if we have concerns to respond directly to the action steps that he set forth in his presentation today. Again, Mr. Phillips, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Enjoy the pleasure. Good afternoon.
Yeah. Okay, moving right along and trying to get us back on schedule here. Our last item on the agenda will be from Ms. Joy Hicks, DEQ Senior Director for Governmental Affairs, on Section 11 of the recently passed 2021 Farm Act. And then following Ms. Hicks' presentation, we will have Ms. Sherry White Williamson and Ms. Naima Muhammad do a presentation from the board's perspective on some of these issues. Ms. Hicks, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is really great to be back with the advisory board today. Happy to be here, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak on this topic. Just to give a overview of what happened in Senate Bill 605, Section 11, and then to give you an update on how we are beginning to implement that bill that has now been signed into law. So before I start going into the particulars of the bill, I thought it might be helpful to give you a little bit of background of some terms that I'll be using today. And I wanted to start with general permit, because you hear that term a lot, but really wanted to make sure that everyone understood that the term general permit at DEQ is used quite broadly because we have general permits across several divisions. A lot of times when you hear the word general permit, because we talk about it so often, you may immediately think of the swine animal feeding operation general permit. But in actuality, if you look on our list of permits that's displayed on our website, you'll see that we have them in air, we have them in coastal, we have them in our Daimler division for stormwater, just to name a few. And so we actually have 3 animal feeding operation general permits, one for dairy, one for what we call wet poultry, poultry facilities that are utilizing a flushing facility, and then what we're concentrating on today and what Section 11 really concentrated on, which is that swine animal feeding operation general permit. In order to be eligible for the existing general permit, in that permit, you have to have a facility that serves more than 250 or more swine, and you have to utilize a non-discharge method of waste disposal. So I wanted to start there with the criteria of what some of the minimum criteria are that you have to have before you could be eligible to be on the general permit. But there's a whole list within our permit of disqualifying or reasons that we would have you to be on an individual permit off of a general permit that includes things like compliance issues in the past, or maybe you have an operation that is very technical, utilizes different technology, has different processes that do not look similar to others, other farms, other operations. So I wanted to set out some of those terms. I also wanted to note that a general permit is issued for 5 years. So our current general permit began October 1st, 2019 for this 5-year cycle. And that general permit, just so you know, we don't just issue a piece of paper and then don't have any additional work during that 5-year time. A general permit requires that that system develop and maintain a certified animal waste management plan. Why is that important? Because that is site specific to that farm, and it bases and requires things like next siting requirements and buffer requirements that tells how and when and where waste can be applied. It further requires testing, soil testing, inspections, and it sets out quite a bit of reporting requirements that system has to report back to the agency. So wanted to kind of fully give you a picture of what a general permit is. And I wanted to note that in statute, the General Assembly indicates very clearly that the intent of the General Assembly is that most animal waste management systems be permitted underneath a general permit. Next slide, please. So another term that you'll be hearing quite a bit today is animal digester. I thought it was important just to maybe let you know that by definition in this Farm Act is inclusive of the entire system. It includes the equipment and the lagoon covers that's going to capture and collect and process the gas. It is going to then that gas will be utilized, the system will be utilized for the digestion of animal biomass, but that gas can be utilized in, it can be directed gas through pipelines, it could be used on site for electric generation, it could be simply flared off, but it is the process of capturing that methane gas. There's a note that I thought you would be interested in. Of the roughly 2,100 total permitted swine facilities that we have in the state, we have already issued 24 permitted animal digester systems within those permitted facilities. And just remember, we'll get to that in a minute, but these are all the farms. There's been a moratorium in place since the late 90s, so the number of farms isn't increasing, but as farms close out, that number has declined over time. So next slide, please. So what we're getting into is the North Carolina Farm Act overview. What was in Section 11 that was very debated requires the commission, that is the Environmental Management Commission, to develop a general permit for animal operations, and it includes the permittee to construct and operate a farm digester system. Looking at that, it will it requires them to develop a general permit, and it requires that it would include similar conditions that are in the existing general permit. So what we think will happen is that we will have a sister permit, one that is a general permit for permitted facilities like we currently have, and then we'll be developing a general permit that will have a lot of the similar conditions plus the ability to have a permitted animal digester. The general permit will be effective 12 months, so we only have 12 months to develop this. The bill went into effect, I believe, July 1, and so 12 months from now, we have been directed to have a permit effective. So when I go through that timeline, you'll see how we're going to respond to that. And then it's important to note that the way that they thought about this being a sister permit, the General Assembly contemplated that the general permit will be put in place if you think 12 months from now. So it will be in July of 2022. In effect, that first round of permits will only be a 2-year permit, not a 5-year permit. But they're doing this and so that they can then sync up and be on the same 5-year rotation of the other general permits. And so that's how this language was adopted and signed into law. But next slide, I think a couple important points again to remind everyone is that the Act would apply to pre-existing permitted facilities, not new farms. So again, it's not adding new farms to the system. It is, and in the language that was in Senate Bill 605, it indicates that a animal digester system cannot increase the permitted capacity of the swine farm, that it cannot increase the total permitted capacity of the animal waste system, that it would have to comply with the siting requirements that are already in statute, and that new digester systems would not be allowed in the 100-year floodplain. So I think those are all important points that we'll be looking at as we're developing that general permit. Next slide, please. One important note I really want to make sure that you all understand is that DEQ was neutral and is neutral on this piece of legislation. We were called on to provide technical assistance and to be able to answer questions. That was important to us to be able to provide technical assistance because we knew that we would be the ones that called on to implement the piece of legislation if it passed and was signed into law. So I want to point out a couple key things that the department provided technical assistance on that were of utmost importance to the department. Number one, you may have seen the bill as filed would have limited the department's ability to hold public hearings and engage with the public. And we indicated up front that that was a non-starter for the department. And so we were able to have that language removed. We maintained the determination authority that indicated that if the department had calls, that we could require an individual permit when necessary, that it would not be an automatic general permit and when you applied for an animal waste digester system, that we could actually require an individual permit instead. The original bill as filed only gave us 6 months to turn this around and implement, and there was no way that we could engage the public and have the level of conversations that we wanted to have. Even a year is a very, very tight timeline, but that was a part that we worked to extend. And so the bill as filed was 6 months, the bill as signed was 1 year. And then finally, we really wanted to negotiate. We've heard a lot of folks comment and have concerns about the 90-day shot clock, meaning once a application is submitted to the commission, there's a 90-day review period. We worked very hard to make sure language was in there to make sure that an application would be completed. So that completed notice of intent, there is language within our rules that spells out what a notice of intent is, and it's a lengthy full application. We wanted to make sure if we only had 90 days to review, that we were getting a complete, thorough document from the requested permitted facility. So that is a list of the kind of highlights of things that we worked on most closely providing technical assistance. So next slide, please. So that leads to, those were the highlights of the bill, but this leads me to, so where are we? The bill becoming effective July 1. We have been working hard internally to set forth a calendar to achieve the July 1 completion date, July 1, 2022 completion date. I can tell you first and foremost that we are going to work very hard to have significant public input. That is very important to us. We are currently in the beginning stages of setting up a stakeholder process. We intend to have a technical work group session or sessions to bring in folks to very specifically talk about some of the details behind the permit. We will hold a public meeting and public forum. We will make sure that we will post drafts for the public. We will have public comment. We will have an open public comment period. We plan on hosting 3 public meetings so that we'll have them spread out across the state. Again, remember that we're not just doing the swine general permit, but we have to do dairy and poultry at the same time. And so that's why we're spreading them out in part, making sure that as much public participation as much of the public can participate as possible. And again, we're going to accept oral, written, and electronic comments. And so that is just more to come. Please stay tuned. We will be engaging this board. We do hope that we hear from you. We fully anticipate that we will hear from you. And we look forward to those comments. You know, just like with all of our permitting processes, the more that we hear from the public, the more good comments that we can take into account, and it strengthens our permitting process. And so we very much look forward to engaging with you all on this conversation. And if, Mr. Chairman, others, if I can help in any way, I'm happy to do so. Thank you for your time today.
Ms. Hicks, thanks so much for your presentation. I hope you can remain on while we hear from Ms. Sherry White Williamson and some of the work that seeing other members of the board have been doing. Ms. White Williamson and Ms. Muhammad, please, we turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. For the board, we intend to talk about all 3 issues that Ms. Hicks just covered, hopefully a little bit more extensively. We don't have as much time as we had planned, but we really want to focus on process because that will be most important when we start trying to put this general permit together. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Naima to take care of the first few slides, and then I'll take it over from there.
Okay, who's controlling the slides?
Next slide, Renee.
India is controlling the slides actually.
India,
So
okay.
if you, yeah.
Okay, sorry, but thank you. Okay, so a part of this presentation is going to include some of the concerns we have about concentrated animal feeding operations. And an animal feeding operation, for those who may not know, I'm sure everybody probably do, an operation where at least 2,500 swine weighing 55 pounds or more are confined on site for more than 45 days during the year under USPA, EPA standards. And they're regulated under the Clean Water Act. And you can see this is what it looks like inside one of the facilities where the animals are kept, how the crowdedness and the little space they had to move around. Next slide, please. And the problem is the lagoon and spray field system has wreaked havoc in eastern North Carolina. Waste from the confined animals periodically flushed into earthen lagoons for storage. The liquid is the liquid from the waste from these lagoons are also used to spray onto the fields and crops around the areas as fertilizer. And DEQ authorizes use of the system under state water quality permits. Next slide, please. And the adverse impacts from this waste management system is the surface water and groundwater in the communities are affected and contaminated from this waste spilling into the river, streams, and ditches in the area. The air is there's stench in the air at all most of the time when people are unable to breathe. They don't even want to be outside. People have reported, literally throwing up from gagging and being outside if the stench is there, not being able to enjoy their quality of life. The soil that we found that there's been soil contamination, and it is a true threat to public health. That's been well documented through research to show that people living in these communities have elevated blood pressures, a lot of upper respiratory problems, high rates of asthma in children, um, stress, anger, and just, downright depression from having to live like that. Next slide, please. And disparate and cumulative impacts. The proportions of African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans statewide living within 3 miles of an industrial swine facility are 1.4, 1.26, and 2.39 times higher than the percentage of non-Hispanic whites, respectively. This was documented and revealed by Dr. Steve Wing and Jill Johnson in 2014. Cumulative impacts are those that result from the incremental effects of the original direct impact combined with the impacts of other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable projects in the area. And this is one of the concerns that we continue to raise because we still don't understand why, when permits are being issued, they're not considering disparate and cumulative impacts before issuing a permit, and let that be the determining factor as to whether or not one more thing is put on top of people when they're already suffering. Next slide, please. And here you're looking at the map of North. This is a map that shows the red dots represent where all the CAFOs are in North Carolina. You're looking at eastern North Carolina. This is the eastern portion of the state that you're looking at. And you can see the number of operations that's in eastern North Carolina. So the majority of the I think it's about 9.7 million pigs in North Carolina. The majority of them are in eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. So our 4 of the top 20 hog producing counties in the country is in eastern North Carolina, with Duplin County ranking number 1, Sampson number 2. Duplin number 1 at 1,957,000 pigs, and Sampson County ringing in at 1.8 million. Bladen with 713,000, and Wayne County at 548,000 pigs. Those are 4 of the top 20 counties in the country for hog production. And these are all counties in eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. So these are some of the failures that have brought demands for change. Eliminating the discharge of animal waste to surface water and groundwater through direct discharge, seepage, or runoff. Substantially eliminate atmospheric emission of ammonia. Substantially eliminate the emission of odor that is detectable beyond the boundaries or the parcel of tract of land on which the swine farm is located. Substantially eliminate the release of disease-transmitting vectors and airborne pathogens, and substantially eliminate nutrient and heavy metal contamination of soil and groundwater. Back to number 3 real quick. There's this myth floating around in our General Assembly that the odor and stuff from these animals don't leave the tract of land that it's produced on. And anybody in their right mind could see, I mean, how would you believe something like that? Air and water does not stand still. There's nobody on this earth that can control the direction of air and water. So for that to be saying that people are making up the fact that it stinks and that this stuff gets into their homes, it's just unbelievable that somebody would fall for that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and so in just the last 5 years, the EPA expressed grave concerns about the disproportionate adverse impact on communities of color in North Carolina. When they came to North Carolina and visited with community members in their homes, they went on a tour of some of the counties in eastern North Carolina where these animals are located and saw the conditions up close and personal, as I always call it. And as a result, they sent a 14-page letter of concern to DEQ addressing some of what they learned while they was here and what their concerns were about it. And increasingly frequent and severe rain events, including 2 1,000-year storms, Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, led to widespread flooding and the structural failure of hog waste lagoons. We know that when those storms happen, millions of gallons of waste went into the flood waters, and there were probably about that many animals that were killed between the pigs, the chickens, and the turkeys that wound up in this water, not to mention all the other contaminants that's in these communities that spilled over, like the coal ash and landfills and Gen X and you name it, it was in the water. Even human waste spilled over. Public health researchers added to the large body of research showing residents living in industrial hog operations have higher rates of deadly diseases, and 5 juries found that operation of the lagoon sprinkler system created nuisance conditions that deprive neighbors of protected property rights. The juries awarded millions of dollars in compensatory and punitive damages. A federal appeals court affirmed liability. In other words, they held the industry responsible for the damages done that people have been documenting for quite a number of years. And someone finally tried to hold this industry accountable. And, so,
Next slide.
and there was still a portion of DEQ that denied this. So this is why we're where we are.
And to pick up from there, some of the movement that we've seen over the years with the hog industry and with the movement forward in 2000, Smithfield Agreement required that there be new technology installed in these facilities. In 2007, the General Assembly created the Lagoon Conversion Program to invest to find out what types of technology was available that could be used. The General Assembly then required the utilities to eventually generate energy from swine. And right now, the state and its renewable energy portfolio requires 0.2% from renewable energy, which is what the industry is calling biogas being produced from methane from hog farms. And finally, in 2018, Smithfield and Dominion formed Align RNG, who now has built a facility in eastern North Carolina in Duplin County, actually, to start processing the methane that's captured from the farms. Next slide, please. Biogas, as it is proposed, uses the Laguna Sprakefield system that is currently in existence. And the way it does that is to increase the amount of methane produced with the cover that is put over the lagoons. And as a result of that, the methane that is produced can be burned to generate energy. Next slide. Biogas in general is the biogas that we're talking about in North Carolina with Align RNG is called directed biogas. And it involves covering hog lagoon trapping the methane, which is somewhat an unnatural way for methane to be decomposed, because in normal circumstances, the amount of methane that is created by covering would not be the amount of methane created if the hog lagoons remained open. That methane that's captured is then transported through a maze of pipeline to a central processing facility. And then they inject this refined gas into natural gas pipelines. Next slide, please. This is a map of the proposed path of the pipeline. The facility that is being built currently is on Highway 24, just on the Duplin County side of the line. 2 of the 4 farms that are proposed to be connected to that facility are approximately 15 miles away. So we're talking about running pipeline over property of many, many people for a distance of 15 miles to get it to where it would be processed. The concerns that we have with biogas at this point is that it does not meet the critical performance standards that Naima mentioned earlier, the 5 standards that that she mentioned. It does not take into consideration the impact of lagoon and spray field system. 3 of the 4 farms currently permitted under individual permits will be allowed to dig an additional lagoon that will be used to capture the methane. While it is not increasing the number of hog farms, it will increase the number or the amount of liquid that is produced and stored for the purpose of creating this methane. Obviously, there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color. As you can see from this map, we've color coded it, and in many situations, 50% of the population around these farms is African American, Native American, or Latino communities. There is also a lack of transparency in this process. To date, we know that this original plan by Align RNG is to connect 19 farms. At this point, there is only knowledge of 4, and the community has not been made aware of where those other 15 farms will be. So obviously there's a lot of concern among community as to the impact that it will have on them. And finally, these facilities are not designed to benefit the host communities. They will only benefit the industry and the money that they will be able to make through this process. Next slide. And the minimum protections that we would ask that this board consider and support would be air and water monitoring, which is not currently required. There needs to be data collection and analysis of all of the information that would be available, and then should be consideration of cumulative impacts. And cumulative impacts will be much easier to figure out if it's an individual farm versus a general permit. And I think that is a conversation that needs to be had very seriously. Next slide. And we would like to make some recommendations for the process for the development of the general permit. We recognize that there will be other opportunities to talk about substantive issues, but we really want to talk about the process and how we can engage and make sure the DEQ is hearing from the community in an appropriate way. Next slide. We are suggesting that there be at least 4 public meetings. 2 of those should be face-to-face meetings, one held in Duplin County and one held in Sampson County, since they are the 2 highest producing hog counties in the country. The period of notice should be at least 60 days, because in many of these communities, as you heard in the earlier IT presentation, do not have access to internet, reliable internet. And so we need to have opportunities in these communities to get the information out to communities so that they can actively participate in these meetings. Extend the period of time for public comment, again, because of the lack of access to reliable internet in many of these communities. Provide Spanish translation for participants with limited English proficiency, because as we noted earlier, about 1.3 times %, or there are about 1.3 times more Hispanic residents likely around these facilities than white individuals. Next slide. Also provide Spanish translation and any draft permits, EJ analysis, and so forth, so that all communities can be aware and have an opportunity to participate. There should be an independent facilitator to enable dialogue. Too often, communities feel like they are being shut out just merely by the actions of many of the staff who tend to facilitate these meetings. DEQ should respond in writing to community concerns. And finally, DEQ should consult with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services to evaluate the health impacts of existing swine CAFOs, so that we can look at those health impacts. And we know from a lot of the work that Steve Wing did years ago that those health impacts are going to be very important. And with that, Mr. Chair, we are completed and we are open for any questions that anyone would like to ask of us.
Thank you, Ms. White Williamson and Ms. Muhammad. We appreciate the presentation. We have a few minutes for questions, and then I want to come back to you all and ask you about recommended next steps based on the work that you've done. So let's open it up for questions for about 5 minutes here, and then wrap up with your recommendation. Do we have questions? We had Ms. Hicks, we had Ms. Muhammad, and Ms. White Williamson.
Dr. Jim Johnson, this is Carolina. I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you for providing that information, specifically the additional insight on public engagement. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Other comments, other questions for our presenters?
I have a question.
Okay, that's Dr. Johnson Thompson, right?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank both Sherry White Williams and Naima Muhammad for putting together a very clear and lucid presentation. There was some mention about this being a general permit, and then I think I heard Sherry saying that it's not suitable for a general permit. So I'd like to hear something from staff about why they feel that it should be, just so that I'll have that information.
I'll unmute myself. So the way a general permit works is when we've had a lot of our general permits developed for kind of industry specific, when facilities look similar. It's a single document with a set of regulations that everyone would comply with. So the General Assembly is the one that is directing us. They feel like there have been enough of these, I guess, permitted, that our general permits for our swine facilities are already, we have a large population of the swine feeding operations under a general permit. They wanted the department to offer a general permit for those that would like to have a digester at that facility. And so we, again, are neutral on this. The department has, through a permit modification request, under the authority and the rules, the statute, when a facility is asked for a permit modification, if it meets the specifications, then we have permitted those digesters. Whether or not it is under a general permit was not the department's decision. That was the General Assembly's decision. But the language that was there directs us to develop that general permit. Does that help?
That helps, but let me ask something more specifically, because you said it several times that the General Assembly directed. Is the General Assembly directing based on scientific information, based on consultants that they have, or is it more to do with what the company wants? Because you're saying that you're neutral, and I don't want to ask you what your personal, I'm not personal, but what the well, maybe I should ask you, how does the department feel about that? I don't know if you're at liberty to say, but my main focus is on when the General Assembly mandates something, where are they getting their information? Do they have consultants or what? How is that? Do you know?
So they, a bill sponsor, Senator Brent Jackson, working with stakeholders, came up with the bill language, and they engaged others that, for lack of a better term, stakeholders like us that would be impacted to provide technical assistance. But the genesis of the idea certainly originated with stakeholders and the bill sponsor. And then that was run through a public process at the General Assembly. I don't know if I completely answered your question, but it wasn't the General Assembly ultimately the General Assembly at large voted on it, but it was a bill filed by a bill sponsor as the genesis.
Thank you. May I add to that answer? The problem that communities have with the general permit is the fact that this is taking a one-size-fits-all view. And not all of these facilities are the same size, nor do they all have the same problems. Many of them have violations. The DEQ generally only has enough staff to visit these facilities once a year, if that. And so there are many concerns within community that with this general permit, there will not be the kind of protections that communities are going to need to have moving forward.
And I would like to add to that the historical view around this our General Assembly and this port industry, and going back as far back as when Wyndham Murphy served in the State House. This industry has been bowing down to the pork industry and giving them whatever they want, and any opposition to them gets met by a bill passed by our General Assembly to protect this industry. That's why nothing can get done. And you know, I have to say this because it's been on my mind. We have a waste management manager at the DEQ who goes into court during the nuisance cases and testify on the behalf of the very industry they supposed to be regulating. And I ain't got over that yet. I still can't figure out how she was able to do that and keep her job, because I don't think nobody else would have. But this is just the kind of power this industry has been yielding in this state, where they just controlling everybody, and then those that's kowtowing to them will do anything to block any opposition to this industry.
We have about 5 minutes left. Ms. White Williamson, you have a specific recommendation that you want to share with the board and about next steps and the like?
Yes, I have an advisory letter that I submitted to you, Chair Johnson, if Ms. Bryant, if you would share that.
And I would like to just say right now, for you know, if I sound upset, it's because I am when it comes to this industry, you know, and I think about the history and all of the suffering and sickness that's in our communities. And one of our fiercest advocates for her community against this energy just recently died, Elsie Herron. And, you know, I mean, it's just heartbreaking, and I don't apologize for being angry, because I am, and I'm just totally pissed off when we talk about this industry. So, you know, I'm trying to maintain my cool.
Thank you, Ms. Muhammad. Ms. White Williamson.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I won't try to read the full advisory at this point, but what we've tried to do here is set out the science, as is our responsibility as a board. So I've provided science in this letter, but at the end, we have included the same 8 recommendations that we made at the end of our presentation. And I would ask that the board consider joining in this advisory and sending it forward to Secretary Beiser for consideration as they are working on this process to make sure that our environmental justice communities are treated fairly in this process.
The crucial question for our advisory board is, do we need a vote on this letter to move it forward? Can someone give us instructions on that from the advisory board? Do we need a vote today, or how do we proceed?
Chairman Johnson, if you'd like to vote to write a letter like this and maybe edit it, then I would suggest that you do make a vote today and have someone second that decision.
Okay. Hopefully everyone, all members of the advisory board have had an opportunity to review the letter. And if so, I would entertain a motion to support the recommendation of Ms. White-Williams and Ms. Muhammad that we make any final edits or feedback on the letter and then forward it to Secretary Beiser on behalf of our advisory committee. Do I have a motion to that effect?
Chair
So
Johnson,
moved.
if it's okay.
It's been
I'll
moved.
second.
It is moved and properly seconded. Can we identify those who introduced the motion and seconded it? Was it Mr. Barber?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, Mr. Barber, and then who seconded it?
Randy Haven O'Donnell.
Ms. Haven O'Donnell. It's been moved and properly seconded that we do one final review of the letter and that we forward it on behalf of the board to Secretary Beiser. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it. Let me wrap up this
Thank you.
session by thanking again Ms. Muhammad and Ms. White-Williamson for their diligence and hard work on and the great presentation today. And I want to thank Ms. Hicks also for presenting and educating us about the permitting process. Any other questions, comments before we're at precisely 5 p.m.? Any other questions, issues, or concerns before I entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting and then prepare for our public comment period at 5:10 p.m.
This is Denney. Just question in regards to the next process. So is there a specific time deadline as to getting comments back, and specifically who do we send the comments back through?
I think within 24 hours.
Be a process?
Within 24 hours, I would invite everyone to review the letter and send comments back to Ms. White-Williamson, Dr. Johnson Thompson, myself, and Ms. Muhammad. And then Dr. Johnson Thompson and myself will take responsibility for finalizing the letter. My fear is if we go any longer than that, it gets lost in a digital pile, and I want it to stay at the top of your digital heap. So within 24 hours. And if we need to come visit you, we will. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, terrific. Any other questions for the order? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting.
I would like to make a motion that we adjourn this meeting.
It's been moved by Ms. Muhammad that we adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and
Sure.
properly seconded that we adjourn the meeting. That was Harris White-Williamson that seconded the motion. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
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 Thank you all. Opposed? Hearing none, we stand adjourned for roughly 10 minutes. Our public comment period will begin at 5:10 p.m. promptly, and we will go for 1 hour. So please take a break and come back at 5:10. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, it is 5:10 p.m. Ms. Kramer, are we all set?
We are all set. I can go ahead and begin calling names if you're ready.
We are ready, I believe. I want to keep us on time if it's all possible. So please proceed.
All right. Thank you. So first, I'm going to call on Stephen Norris, followed by Anita Cunningham. So Stephen Norris, if you are on the phone, if you could please press *3 to raise your hand. All right, I think Mr. Norris.
Thank you. Thank you to the advisory board and all of you for hearing us. I'm Dr. Stephen Norris. I'm the president of the Alliance to Protect the People and the Places We Live and a member of Beyond Extreme Energy. I want to make an appeal to the advisory board similar to what Greta Thunberg of Sweden has made to the international community. Greta said, I want you to panic. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. And we are not doing enough about climate change or about environmental justice. We are actually losing these battles. The UN recently published the most recent IPCC report, which states that we are in a code red emergency. The IPCC scientists warn global warming of 2 degrees centigrade will be exceeded during the 21st century unless rapid and deep reductions in CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. This assessment is based on very reliable data and science on historical warming, as well as progress in scientific understanding of the response of the climate systems to human-caused emissions. We are at and maybe beyond the tipping point regarding climate change. British Columbia's temperature recently hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit in an area that rarely reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you all know, who are paying attention to the news, there is multiple other evidence around the world about climate change and all of the injustices, including environmental injustice, which it is producing. Multiple superstorms, flooding, and loss of life, loss of beaches and barrier islands in North Carolina, including, of course, the loss of life here in North Carolina because of the recent storm just last week. Droughts and massive wildfires, which we've all heard about, mass extinctions of multiple birds and animals, and so on and so on, water loss, and so on and so on. Like Ms. Muhammad said, these events in the U.S. and in North Carolina in particular invariably impact poor people and people of color and indigenous people who are already suffering more due to climate impacts and cumulative impacts, significantly more than more affluent areas of the state and the nation. Methane, as you all know, is the worst greenhouse of gas and traps more than 100 times more heat than CO2, 100 times more heat. DEQ must start denying all permits for methane-related projects, like the partnership between Dominion and Smithfield to market
Thank you, Mr. Norris.
methane.
Unfortunately, your 3 minutes are up. If you'd like to submit written comments, please email them to ej@ncdnr.gov and we'll make sure that the board gets those. Thank you. Up next, we have Anita Cunningham, followed by Danielle Kuntz. Ms. Cunningham, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Great.
Hi, my name is Anita Cunningham, and I'm with the Robeson County Cooperative for Sustainable Development and also a resident of Robeson County in eastern North Carolina. I don't want any wood pellet facilities in my neighborhood, and I feel there is a definite target for racial injustice by these big companies bringing or wanting to bring in wood pellet facilities. that weaken the health of the residents in my community and have a clear negative impact on the air and water quality of North Carolinians. The production of wood pellets has immediate community-wide impacts on air and water quality. It has been noted in numerous articles and reports that the siting of wood pellet production facilities in the Southeast finds that they are 50% more likely to be located in environmental justice designated communities. Wood pellet production and their emissions are harmful and produce a number of negative effects on the health of the communities that surround these plants, such as the particulate matter in the air, airborne pollutants such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and others, and degrades the local air quality, air and water quality. These powerful outside entities benefit from cheap labor and capital costs, in addition to generous subsidies from the states and the federal government. In addition, the biomass and coal are usually burned on site to generate these products, and that process has harmful emissions from the shipping and processing, along with the increased road and rail traffic, noise pollution, and degradation of the regional water quality and ecosystem. Mr. Brian Phillips, who was here, talked about that the most pollution is in North Carolina, that the leading cause is because of trucks and cars here in North Carolina. So I ask that you please ask for detailed and comprehensive reports on the cumulative impact of the wood pellet facilities that are applying or reapplying for air quality, air or water permits in the communities where these facilities are being housed. And please consider not giving subsidies and monetary awards prior to these companies' approval and location and information regarding their permits and the cumulative impact reports that I mentioned before. And I would just like to thank Naima Muhammad and Sherry White Williamson for that report and support for environmental justice, and appreciate the board's approval of that and support of that. And I just ask that you go a little farther and understand that these companies are impacting us in a very negative way, clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Next up, we have Danielle Kuntz, followed by Will Hendrick. Danielle, I don't see your name listed, so if you're joining us by phone, if you could please press *3 to raise your hand. All right, Danielle, I don't see a hand raised. So we'll move on to Will Hendrick. Hi, Mr. Hendrick.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you may begin.
Great. Good evening. My name is Will Hendrick, and I'm an environmental justice advocate with the North Carolina Conservation Network. I first want to thank the board for voting to issue a formal advisory statement. This will be the first formal advice provided by this board since July 2020, and the first since the adoption of new operating procedures last fall. I hope that board advice will issue more frequently in the future, as there are many EJ issues meriting your attention and your input. As someone who's appeared before this board countless times to urge action on CAFO issues, I'm especially pleased to see the board advise DEQ concerning the process by which the agency will solicit public input regarding the new biogas general permit. This is critical in light of the harm caused by permitted swine operations and the disparate impact of that harm on communities of color and low income, as underscored in Ms. White Williamson's and Ms. Muhammad's presentation. The meaningful involvement of these impacted North Carolinians is critical to advancing environmental justice. But so too is the fair treatment of these North Carolinians. I understand that the board will hold a special meeting to continue addressing biogas concerns, and I urge the board to address substantive issues regarding biogas projects. Board guidance would be valuable, for instance, regarding the terms of the permit in question, the evaluation of the cumulative impacts of permitted facilities, and the instances in which an individual permit, rather than coverage under a general permit, should be required. Of course, we all know your guidance is not a guarantee of agency action, nor indeed should it be a prerequisite to agency progress on environmental justice. But we hope that under Secretary Beiser's leadership, DEQ will regularly solicit formal advice from this board, and that you will stand ready to issue it. After all, an advisory body performs its intended function not by merely discussing agency action, but instead by offering advice to influence agency action. And there are far too many actions that would be better advised and hopefully have less impact on communities of color and low income if they benefited from your guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Jeff Curry, followed by Blakely Hildebrand. All right, you are unmuted.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you may begin.
All right, thank you for the opportunity to comment today. And I also want to say thank you to the members of the board who have worked for change in our communities. Since November 2018, I've been present either in person or on this platform for just about every environmental justice board meeting. And at almost 3 years later, I still feel that there's not been a huge amount of movement to address issues of pollution that's concentrated in vulnerable EJ communities across Eastern North Carolina. In fact, the situation with pollution and environmental injustices is worse. The explosion in virtually unregulated poultry operations that pollute our air and waterways has not been abated, and poultry operations are still allowed to be built in 100-year floodplains. The growth and proliferation of wood pellet mills that deforest wetland, bottomland forests in our communities, which contributes to increased and worse flooding, has not been addressed. And the legislature enabled push to harvest biogas and lay more pipelines that will crisscross our communities and cut more forests and go through more wetlands. Continue and while allowing those hog operations to continue to be a nuisance from the lagoon and Sprayfield system not be addressed. And on top of all that, DEQ has used shaky scientific evaluations of more than one permit, at least 2, if not 3. And I'm still waiting for a real evaluation from DEQ on cumulative impacts in EJ communities, something that I feel they're mandated to do. So I wonder today whether I should even come to this meeting or whether I should speak, because I'm frustrated. I want change. I want progress. I want to do something about the pollution in the air, pollution of water in our communities across Eastern North Carolina. But I'm tired of beating my head against a brick wall, because that doesn't make progress. It's only giving me concussions. So I applaud those who are working for change, and I hope that you continue to do so. And I hope that the board will push harder to change the situation in Eastern North Carolina and in our communities and in our waterways. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. Up next, we have Blakely Hildebrand, followed by Marvin Winstead. Hold on. All right, Ms. Hildebrand, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Blakely Hildebrand, and I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I want to first thank you all for your service on the board, this very important board, and for the opportunity to provide public comment today. As Ms. Muhammad and Ms. White-Williamson explained so well, biogas is a significant environmental justice issue. We hope that the board will hold a special meeting to get into more detail about the issues that Ms. Muhammad and Ms. White-Williamson outlined for the board this evening. At that time, we hope the board will strongly advise the department to put in place meaningful and robust protections for community members and for the environment in the forthcoming biogas general permit. Chief among those protections should be technology requirements to address the water and air pollution, odors, and public health issues that are that plague communities that live near these hog operations. Cleaner technologies to address these issues exist and are available to the industry, and DEQ must require these technologies moving forward. Ms. Hicks said that DEQ wants to receive a lot of public comments on the general permit before issuing it. And Ms. White-Williamson and Ms. Muhammad laid out a series of recommendations that would enable community members to provide comments to the agency in a number of ways. We appreciate the board's willingness to move forward with recommendations regarding the public comment process for the forthcoming general permit, and ask that the board adopt the recommendations that were outlined by Ms. Muhammad and Ms. White-Williamson this evening. Thank you again for your service on the board. Thank you for your time, and that is all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Marvin Winstead, followed by Larry Baldwin. Marvin Winstead, are you on the phone? If you have called in, please press *3 to raise your hand. I don't see Marvin Winstead, so we'll come back. Oh, I found Marvin Winstead. Hello.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, sorry. You may
It's okay.
begin.
All right. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the board for this opportunity to speak to you today, and I would also like to thank the members of the board for their service to this board. History tells us that Roman Emperor Nero fiddled while Rome burned. We also know that when societies or cultures ignore lessons learned from history, those societies and cultures are doomed to repeat the tragedies of history again. Today, the fossil fuel and electric utility industries, the corporate Neros of our time, are fiddling away our chance to take affirmative actions to ward off climate change. Last week, the UN announced the scientific committee report, the IPCC report, and alerted every country on our planet that climate change is here now. It is not a few years away as previously thought. It is here now. In spite of this alarm to the world, the greed-driven corporate giants of the fossil fuel and electric utility industries continue their plans to reach zero emissions goals for greenhouse gases in the year 2050. That is simply too late. 29 years too late. I ask the advisory board to be the Paul Revere of today and use its far-reaching influence to encourage the leadership of North Carolina to take steps now to curtail greenhouse gas emissions, especially natural gas emissions, which, by the way, natural gas is 95% methane, and this most definitely includes biogas. The Southern Environmental Law Center recently sent the advisory board a 20-plus paper document about biogas. I completely agree with all of the documented points that this communication conveys about the very negative problems caused by biogas, some of which we've heard today. The greed-driven companies that are promoting biogas have not substantiated any of their claims. They are only looking to increase their profits. I encourage you again today, please sound the alarm. Thank you very much.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. My apologies. Up next, we have Larry Baldwin, followed by Amanda Strouderman. Mr. Baldwin, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to start by thanking Ms. White-Williamson and Ms. Muhammad for the letter that they drafted and now this board has endorsed. I would urge you that that letter should not just be between this board and Secretary Beiser. A copy of this letter needs to go to every legislator, every newspaper across North Carolina. People are wanting to hear that somebody is trying to do something. And I have to agree with the sentiments of one of the previous speakers where there was a lot of high hopes from this particular board that unfortunately have not really been proven to come true. There are some extremely competent and powerful names on this board. And I hope that this is a first step in this board really taking advantage of the power that you do have to help with change. We're talking some tonight about biogas. Biogas, I've been a waterkeeper for almost 19 years. Been working on this issue with CAFOs for all that time. This is probably, if not the best, one of the biggest impacts negatively that this industry has come up with. A hog grower in North Carolina who is very familiar with this process has stated himself, this is nothing but a Band-Aid to put over a waste system that will do nothing but perpetuate the impacts to our water, to our air, and our communities. I feel this board has a responsibility, and you've apparently been given the voice to speak for the communities. And this biogas issue is much larger than maybe even all of you realize it is. The negative impacts, it's not doing anything to fix the problem. In fact, in some ways, as you saw in some of the slides that I believe Miss White Williamson had, it's going to actually increase the negative impacts to the waste being sprayed from these hog facilities. So I do applaud you all greatly for this step tonight, but please don't let this be the candle under the basket. This has to get out to prove to the communities and to prove to our state government that, as the old movie Network famous line says, we're mad as heck and we're not going to take it anymore. That's where our communities, that's where our environment is right now. We can't take anymore. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. Up next, we have Amanda Strouderman, followed by Lib Hutchby. Ms. Strouderman, you've been unmuted.
Thank you. My name is Amanda Strouderman, and I'm with Clean Water for North Carolina. I wanted to start out by saying I'm grateful that environmental justice is on the political radar. It's progress that we have an EJ advisory board for DEQ, and it's progress that Governor Cooper established the Andre Harris Task Force. But it won't mean much at all if the voices of impacted community members are systematically silenced. Now, this is happening through a number of ways, including DEQ's own public participation plan. But for the sake of time, let me be specific. When you only have an opportunity to speak out against a general permit for anaerobic digesters for swine biogas, you can't speak to the specific details of the single hog operation that is subject to flooding from 500 and 1,000-year floods that are occurring more regularly, and the fact that putting a cover over it won't prevent hog waste from spilling over into waterways and impacting groundwater. You can't mention the fact that a particular facility has had multiple or even current violations for keeping their lagoons too full. So why should they be permitted to pose additional threats to the community? And you don't get to mention that the neighboring hog farm will now have not one, but 2 lagoons. And while one might be covered up, the other is going to remain open. And now you have twice the amount of waste in your backyard with double the risk of flooding. Sure, you can talk about the fact that Smithfield Foods had an agreement to find a better waste management technology, and that in other states they implement such better systems, only to be told that it's too expensive and they can't afford it, and what works in one state might not work in another. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And yet when you state that our own state official points out that, well, then maybe we shouldn't be considering a one-size-fits-all permitting, your voice is ignored. Well, I can tell you that these communities can't afford. They can't afford to lose another Elsie Herring, who spent the latter part of her life trying to be heard about the health and environmental impacts of the hog waste lagoon and sprayfield system. They can't afford the loss of any more unnamed mothers, fathers, siblings, friends, suffering health conditions that may be linked to exposure to hog feces being sprayed near their homes. We may be bound in this moment by current legislation and rules that are in place, but it's up to all of us to take steps to make changes for the better. For the EJ/EAB, that responsibility is to speak out on behalf of EJ communities and advise the Secretary of the DEQ. So thank you for voting to sign on to the letter earlier in this meeting. It's up to you to take a position that elevates the voices of the impacted and make sure opportunities for speaking their truth aren't silenced by the procedures and processes of the agency tasked with protecting them. Thank you for your service on this board, and to Elizabeth Beiser for staying to listen to comments.
Thank you, Ms. Strouderman. Up next, we have Lib Hutchby, followed by Heather Deck.
Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Hutchby,
Wonderful.
you are ready.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and for your presence, for staying to listen to the public comment. I know that it's been a tough board meeting to listen to. I want to be able to say to the DEQ, I'm sorry, but I feel really very frustrated to hear anyone at the DEQ say that we're going to be neutral. Howard Zinn said we can't be neutral on a moving train. And this business of climate change has gotten to the point of crisis. We all know that. We all know that even though we have paid attention to biogas today, thank you again to Ms. White Williamson and Ms. Muhammad for the latter. I want you to know that the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom of the national level Earth Democracy Issue Group supports your work. And if you need support with a signing of the letter, we will be happy to do that. The waste that's been created by concentrated feeding operations exceeds human waste in North Carolina. It's created poisoned air and contaminated water. We've said it over and over again. Over 20 years ago, the state research NCSU had found alternatives to spray fuel systems. So why has someone and some authority not demanded that Smithfield follow through on what they said they'd do 20 years ago? How can we trust they're going to do anything that they say they'll do ever again? So I totally personally oppose renewable natural gas because there isn't such a thing. It is only going to produce methane in huge quantities and poison my friends. And first we should say, let's clean it up. Let's clean up our air. Let's clean up our water. Let's respect the people in the neighborhood who have already suffered and have been diseased by what we know has been poisoned. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to bring this to you, and thank you so much for your service on this board. And I really hope and pray that the DEQ will listen and follow through on these things for a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchby. Next up, we have Heather Deck, followed by Emily Zucchino.
Hi, yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great,
Yes,
thank
you
you. Good afternoon. I'm Heather Deck. I'm the executive director of Sound Rivers. We're a 40-year-old nonprofit dedicated to protecting the water resources, health, and justice of communities within the Neuse and Pamlico River basins. And I'm here today speaking on behalf of our Pamlico Tar and Neuse River Keepers and our 2,500 members. I first want to say that I'm very appreciative of the presentation by Ms. Muhammad and White Williamson today and the board's actions to provide advice on the process for which DEQ solicits meaningful public input regarding the creation of the new general permit for CAFOs with digesters. We very much look forward to the continuation of this conversation and the special meeting that I understand is scheduled for September. This board's meaningful involvement in this long-standing issue of justice is so critical for so many North Carolina families and for the environment. And future action is certainly justified and required. Specifically, we hope the board will look to formally advise DEQ to fully evaluate the cumulative impacts of its permitting decisions, including impacts to water and air resources, public health, from all of the permitted industrial hog operations producing biogas, and other industrial agriculture, as well as other industrial facilities within the area. The department is long overdue to have a clear process for evaluating these cumulative impacts when it makes decisions, and this board's input can be very key to that process. I also wanted to pivot quickly and provide some comments on another important topic. Every 3 years, the Department and Division of Water Resources evaluates standards that they use for water quality and for the protection of public health. And as I believe many of you are likely aware, the state is currently in that process this summer. Our organization, along with Waterkeepers Carolina, which is a coalition of all of the river keepers across the state, and many other environmental and environmental justice groups, have provided comments and identified concerns to the department. During this process, it became clear that the Division of Water Resources did not conduct an EJ, an environmental justice analysis, on their draft rule changes, even though they commented on the need to do so. Advocates have tried to communicate with the department about this concern and the need for a clear process for future rulemaking, but have not been invited to meet on this issue until this board provides its input. So it's our hope that the board will provide timely guidance to the agency to ensure that meaningful environmental justice analysis are part of future rulemaking efforts. And I just wanted to end by thanking you all so much for your time and your information that you're willing to share, and for the opportunity today to provide these comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Deck. Up next, we have Emily Zucchino, followed by Reverend Mac Ledgerton. Ms. Zucchino, you have been unmuted.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. I work with Dogwood Alliance, the leading forest protection organization in the southern U.S. I've spoken to this advisory board a number of times about the wood pellet biomass industry in North Carolina, and I echo some of the frustration I've heard from others tonight, especially in regards to having to continually oppose false solutions that are harming people and harming the climate. Impacted community members and environmental organizations have provided Governor Cooper, NCDEQ, and others in the Cooper administration with detailed evidence of the forest, climate, and pollution impacts of the wood pellet industry. While the governor excluded wood pellets from the 2019 North Carolina Clean Energy Plan, acknowledging some of their impacts and curtailing their domestic use, he has done nothing to address the impacts of the wood pellet export market, and NCDEQ continues to approve every permit that allows for new or expanded wood pellet facilities. North Carolina is now the largest exporter of wood pellets in the nation. This is extremely disheartening under an administration that has pledged leadership on climate change and environmental justice. Dogwood Alliance, in coordination with individuals and organizations who live in counties with wood pellet facilities, have prepared a petition with concrete actions that Governor Cooper and North Carolina DEQ can take immediately to address the wood pellet industry. We are calling on Governor Cooper to commit to the 4 following items. 1, direct the NC Department of Commerce to halt all future subsidies, grants, and incentives for the biomass industry. North Carolina has subsidized this industry with $7 million, yet the counties with wood pellet facilities remain some of the poorest in the state. We are using taxpayer dollars that don't advance the green economy or support long-term jobs and investment in rural communities. Number 2, direct NCDEQ to deny all future permits for proposed industrial energy projects that are not a part of the NC Clean Energy Plan or EO80, such as biomass. We've seen that the wood pellet industry, which is led by Enviva, clear cuts 60,000 acres of North Carolina forest per year. And if we were to fully account for the emissions from these wood pellet production facilities, we would see they've released 28 million tons of carbon dioxide. Number 3, direct NCDEQ to accurately and transparently account for and reduce emissions from the forestry sector. These are currently not being accounted in the greenhouse gas inventory. And number 4, direct NCDEQ to complete a comprehensive study into the forest, climate, and community impacts of the existing wood pellet industry in North Carolina. I hope that this advisory board can join us in supporting these actions and encouraging DEQ and Governor Cooper to take action on this issue that has been brought to their attention multiple times by multiple stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zucchino. Up next, we have Reverend Mac Ledgerton, followed by Connor Kipp.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you may begin.
Yes, I'm Reverend Mac Ledgerton, co-director of the Robeson County Cooperative for Sustainable Development and interim director at the North Carolina Climate Solutions Coalition. The AERP wood pellet facility in Lumberton is the 5th wood pellet facility to be permitted by NCDEQ in our state. The AERP is a highly controversial facility on multiple accounts, and I will include 7 in this short presentation. 1, the air and water pollution from AERP's new manufacturing process have never been commercially tested and analyzed. Its risks to the public are totally unknown. 2, AERP discharged industrial stormwater without a required Clean Water Act permit and only applied for a permit only after receiving a notice of intent to sue from Winyah Rivers Alliance, represented by SCLC. 3, AERP redesigned its pellet mill and its construction and installed new equipment without a required air quality permit. This action required a notice of violation from DEQ, and DEQ has now ordered AERP to stop construction. AERP also faces current litigation in federal court over ongoing wastewater discharges into the Lumber River in violation of the Clean Water Act. 5, in its modified air quality permit before DEQ, some of the air pollution released by AERP will actually increase. And this is in contrast to what AERP is saying to the public. In addition, all 5 of the wood pellet facilities in North Carolina are in environmental justice census tracts, communities, and counties. The census tract in Lumberton is 90% Black, in the county of Robeson that already is home to over 850 polluters. Lastly, over 50 people signed up to speak at the 2020 DEQ public hearing in opposition to the proposed facility prior to DEQ's permit approval. Because of the compliance issues with the company and the unknowns around this facility, plus the overwhelming community opposition during the last permitting process, multiple organizations will place a formal request with DEQ to hold a public hearing on the modified air quality permit application before DEQ. Multiple organizations will also file a formal request with the Environmental Justice, Equity, and Advisory Board to review the proposed AERP project and make a recommendation to DEQ and DEQ regarding the holding of a public hearing on the modified air quality permit. We definitely need good jobs in North Carolina, particularly in the East, but we don't need more jobs from dirty industries that harm both public and environmental health. All of Eastern North Carolina is overburdened with dirty industry. Our people and places in the East are worthy of the same respect that our urban communities do and get to protect its environmental and public health. And thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Connor Kipp, followed by Rebecca Drohan. Hi, Mr. Kipp, you have been unmuted.
Thank you. Hello, members of the board. Firstly, I want to thank you for your work helping make North Carolina a more environmentally just and equitable state. I'm Connor Kippy, the policy advocate for toxic-free North Carolina. I'm speaking to voice our position on the general permitting of the biogas digesters. We all know, and as many others have said throughout the night, that biopollution from hog industry has degraded the environment and harmed many of the communities in rural eastern North Carolina. Inequitable health from CAFO impacts include noxious odors, pathogen transmission, and respiratory disorders, among others. While we understand DEQ is directed to create a general permit for these CAFOs, we would like to underline some points of information and request some technical and process priorities. Creating a general permit does not take into account the disparate effects on different communities of all of these different types of CAFOs that exist. Many of these communities may also be facing inequitable distribution of pesticide runoff, PFAS contamination, and other environmental health stressors on top of living in areas identified as historically underserved communities. This portion of the state, in its downstream position, always will also experience an accumulation of other toxic chemicals in its recreational waters on top of the biopollution and other sources from these CAFOs. We would also like to reiterate what other organizations have said tonight. With biogas digester systems, benefits also being overplayed in terms of their benefits in reducing carbon or climate emissions, methane emissions specifically. And we would like to put emphasis on the cumulative impacts of these CAFO biodigesters, the known particulates that will escape from them, and emphasize that as the general permit creation process goes forward. Listening to each community allows for community-led solutions that will best protect the health of these communities. A general permit does not do this, but within the creation of this general permit process, we would like to put forward some recommendations that could best accommodate listening to these communities. We would like to ask that NCDEQ holds more than 3 public hearings, that those hearings are offered both virtual and in person, with an independent facilitator, and have advanced notice that provide a much longer time period for providing more opportunities for long-form written comment as well. We would also like to endorse the suggestions put forward by board members Nima Mohammed and Sherry White-Williamson in using best technology practices to control the escape of some of these particulates and other emissions that can harm those communities already burdened. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kippy. Up next, we have Rebecca Drohan, followed by Joel Porter. Ms. Drohan, you have been unmuted.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rebecca Drohan, and I am with Coastal Carolina River Watch, a water quality advocacy organization based in Carter and Onslow counties. And thank you for your time tonight and your consideration of Ms. Mohammed and Ms. White-Williamson's letter. And I just want to voice my support for their recommendations and echo those who spoke before me, in that biogas does nothing to improve the outdated lagoon and spray field system. It can create incentives for these inactions and worsen the pollution and dangers from existing hog facilities. Biogas projects will perpetuate the water contamination, air pollution, and degraded quality of life in surrounding communities. We all know that this data shows that this occurs disproportionately in communities of color and low income, where little to nothing has been done to protect these communities from health impacts, mortality, and the ability to enjoy their homes and environment. Focus on monitoring, additional data, and cumulative effects need to be examined. And in addition to considering the environmental and the health impacts of biogas projects, measures to improve transparency and community engagement need to be taken as well. Regarding that process, please hold in-person public hearings with meetings taking place in the most impacted counties. Virtual options need to be available as well, but as we were hearing earlier today, accessibility can be a huge barrier. So consulting with those communities on the best options for inclusive accessibility so that everyone can participate. We need adequate notice of public hearings, time for feedback, and independent facilitators, along with Spanish translations for all outreach and meetings. And as an environmental justice and equity board, I would ask that you please uphold those commitments and practice accountability related to these matters, to listen to those most affected and to protect the right to clean water and clean air for everybody in North Carolina. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Strohan. Up next, we have Joel Porter, and then we'll try one more time for Danielle Kuntz. All right, Mr. Porter, you have been unmuted.
Thanks, Renee. Chairman Johnson, Secretary Advisor, members of the board, my name is Joel Porter. I'm the Policy Manager at Clean Air NC. Thank you for allowing members of the community to speak this evening. My organization is very pleased you've chosen to engage on biogas projects. On the issue of the biogas general permit, we hope the board will fulfill its charter obligations, adopt the recommendations by Mrs. White Williamson and Ms. Muhammad, and advise the department on ways that it can conduct enhanced and meaningful outreach to underserved communities and take necessary steps to avoid agency action that would have a disparate impact on communities of color or low income. And to echo Mr. Hendrick from earlier, I hope this is the first of many formal recommendations to come as you move forward from here on out. Vulnerable North Carolinians continue to bear disproportionate brunt of environmental impacts from industrial animal operations. A major reason for that is the current permitting process does not take into account the total of all pollutants emitted. We are glad there will be 3 public hearings, but we hope that DEQ will safely but physically conduct enhanced input and solicit opinions from the frontline communities that these projects will impact. There is a clear nexus between water emissions and air emissions. Chemicals emitted from the lagoon and spray field waste management process are contain dangerous pollutants that not only affect the watershed, but affect the airshed as well. Putting a biodigester over top a waste lagoon isn't a one-size-fits-all solution that will eliminate all of the problems posed by waste pits. They may suppress some of the noxious odors and other emissions associated with the projects. However, the whole purpose of an anaerobic digester, in fact, is to maximize waste slurry and optimize it for an increased output of methane, a dangerous greenhouse gas. Our organization, formerly Clean Air Carolina, has recently undergone a substantial change. Our name now contains the acronym AIRE, A-I-R-E, which stands for Action and Innovation to Restore the Environment. DEQ has a unique opportunity to take a page from our new branding and to act innovatively to create a general permit that restores the environment. Indeed, the challenge the hog and poultry industry has faced is that many of these innovative and environmentally superior solutions to agricultural waste are cost prohibitive. So, at least they say. Solutions, especially technological solutions, need to be safely and quickly scaled up to meet the challenges communities face, all while restoring the environment and creating new economic opportunities to benefit from. To that end, DEQ should ensure that a general permit is flexible enough to accomplish those aforementioned goals while ensuring that pollution from all relevant sources are accordingly mitigated. Thank you very much. We look forward to continuing to engage as this process moves further.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. One more time, I will try for Danielle Kuntz. If you are on the phone, please go ahead and press *3 to raise your hand. And I will check one more time. And I do not see Danielle Kuntz. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Chairman Johnson. That is the end of the public comment signups.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. On behalf of the advisory board, I want to thank all of you who rendered public comment today. We are grateful to you for taking the time to join our meeting and to give us feedback and direction and advice on the important problems that we face in the state of North Carolina, and giving us guidance on how we can do a better job of advising DEQ on these pressing environmental issues. We're eternally grateful to you for that. And we hope you will come back for our next meeting and keep holding us accountable for the work that needs to be done. With that, if there are no other comments, Ms. Kramer, I think we stand to be adjourned. To all the board members, thank you all for your work. You have 24 hours to get feedback to us. Dr. Thompson Johnson's got a Hummer. We'll come by and visit you if you don't get it back into us in a timely manner. So we're going to be waiting for that feedback so we can get the letter. And I want to thank again Ms. Muhammad and Ms. White Williamson for their outstanding work. And I don't want to leave out Jamie Cole either, because she was one of the prime drivers in moving us in this direction. So Ms. Cole, we want to thank you as well. All be safe, please. And we hope to see you again soon. Good evening. Thanks, Renee.